Well, thanks for joining us, everyone. This is a great opportunity to hear the paper from Oswaldo Amaral on remembering and repairing the authoritarian past in Argentina and Brazil. The paper has been circulated. If any of you on the call would like to have not received the paper and would like to receive it, I can send it to you afterwards. And this is to advise you all as well that this Zoom call is being recorded for purposes of the Brazil Week, and there'll be opportunities for Q&A after Oswaldo's presentation. So I'm welcoming Oswaldo as part of Brazil Week on behalf of the Brazil Institute, and also on behalf of the Authoritarianism and Populism Research Group in the School of Global Affairs, and the entire King's community. And Oswaldo comes to us by way of the Department of Political Science at the State University of Campinas, Unicamp. He's also the director of the Public Opinion Studies Center there, and his work focuses on the Brazilian party system, party organization, especially the organization of the Workers' Party, electoral behavior, and public opinion. And he's now a visitor in Paris, which is why we're lucky enough to get him for this event. Oswaldo did an undergraduate degree in international relations at the Pontifical Catholic University of Sao Paulo, PUC Sao Paulo. He did a master's degree in social sciences at the same university, and his PhD was at Unicamp, and he wrote his thesis on changes in the internal organization of the Workers' Party between 1995 and 2009. Oswaldo's been a visiting professor at the University of Salamanca in Spain. He's been a visiting researcher at the University of Oxford in the UK and the University of Notre Dame in the US. That's how Christoph would like to be pronounced. It's actually pronounced Notre Dame in the US, but we all know where it is. That's where Oswaldo was as a visiting researcher at one point. Between 2013 and 2017, Oswaldo was the coordinator of the research group on political parties and party systems of the Latin American Political Science Association, ALACIP. And amongst his many publications are his book, Transformations in the Internal Organization of the Workers' Party, 1995-2009. That was published by Alameda Fapesp in 2013. And just to give you a flavor of some of his recent work, The Victory of Jair Bolsonaro According to the Brazilian Electoral Study of 2018, which came out in the Brazilian Political Science Review in 2020, and the PT at 35, Revisiting Scholarly Interpretations of the Brazilian Workers' Party in the Journal of Latin American Studies in 2016. So thank you for coming, Oswaldo, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Anthony. You can all hear me, I think. If something happens, just let me know, Anthony. You can pop in anytime you want. So I'd like to thank Anthony for this opportunity. I'd like to thank the Brazil Institute, the research group for the opportunity to present this paper, which actually took a long time to be done because of the pandemics and everything. So I'm really happy to have this opportunity to share this paper with you. I'm going to show some slides, and in the back of the first one is in the end of the first one there is my email. So if you want the paper, besides writing to Tony, you can also write me and I can send you the paper in English. It's actually in English. So the idea for this work was to deal with two different things. One thing was like the literature regarding the adherence or the support for democracy in different countries, and also to check lasting outcomes from the transitions, and also to see if that would help us to explain why Brazil tolerates a politician that it's always exhorting, always saying good things about the authoritarian regime in Brazil, and another country like Argentina has much more rejection to that. I would like to say that we say that in the paper, that the political costs of doing this in Argentina is much higher than in Brazil. So the idea was to check this, and also to help to understand how the President Bolsonaro became actually the president, how he was able to win the election, saying good things about torturers and about torture and about the crimes that the state committed during the authoritarian regime between 64 and 85. So I'm going to share my screen and we can go through it. Okay, I don't know why it disappeared. Okay, sorry. Okay, now you're good, right? So this is actually the actual name of the paper. We took a couple of suggestions after sending it the first name to Anthony. So we decided to change a little bit because this brings a better idea of what the paper is about. The paper was co-authored by a close friend and a colleague. She's a professor at the University of Buenos Aires and also a researcher at the CONICET. Her name is Dolores Roca Rivarola. So I'd like to thank her for, although she's not here, I'd like to thank her for this incredible work that we were able to do together. And I learned a lot with her and her knowledge about the transition and all the policies that came after that regarding transitional justice in Argentina. The main question of the paper, and we actually opened the paper with a statement from the Army General Braga Neto, right, saying, well, dictatorship was not that bad. We had to do that in 64 because the world was divided. And like 1 week before that, he did that on the anniversary of the so-called revolution, right? The coup d'etat that happened in 64. And like 1 week before, or a couple of days before, in Argentina, as usual, there was a huge demonstration against the dictatorship that took the Plaza de Mayo. So we actually opened the paper with that. And this is exactly, I think, the image, the picture that we want to explain with this paper. So we seek to understand how two countries that experienced at similar times, ruled by authoritarian regimes, but also huge fluctuations in their economic performance, even more in Argentina than in Brazil. And they ended up developing consistently different levels of support for democracy. I'm going to show some of the graphs later, and it's going to be very clear to see these consistent different levels of support for democracy. Basically, what we are calling support for democracy here is that a very known question in which we ask people if they would support democracy, even being not even having its own problems, if people don't care, or if people sometimes would support an authoritarian regime. So we basically took the people who answered, who agreed with the first assumption, who agreed with the first sentence, as people saying that they support democracy. This has been used for a long time, like since the works of Linz and others. Our central argument is that the different process of transition to democracy in the two countries produce different institutional arrangements around policies of reparation and memory about the authoritarian regimes, the one in Brazil between 64 and 85, as I mentioned, the other one in Argentina between 76 and 83, as well as different possibilities of political interference by armed forces in democratic periods. This is really important because these two things are intertwined, right? Both the possibility of intervention by the armed forces in politics and the policies of reparation actually developed by both countries. So the article aims to contribute to two literatures. The first dealing with the factors that can interfere with adherence to democracy. So basically we're saying, hey, there is one variable here that has always missed a little bit, or it has always been missed by most of the studies. Is the variable about how countries that experience authoritarian regimes, they deal with them. And the second one is addressing transition process to democracy and long-term repercussions. What we say is that different paths to transition in both countries. In Argentina was like characterized as collapse. In Brazil, it was more, how do I say that? It was speculated. It was like more a pact between elites. So they have long-term repercussions, and this is something we would like to address in the paper. Well, we adopted a research design for similar cases, which is very simple. There are too many variables to control, so our main goal was to highlight one of the variables that had not been highlighted before. So we seek to find, by comparing two cases with many similarities, region, experienced dictatorship at the same time, huge economic loopings, and we would like to see if what could explain that difference in the levels of support for democracy. As data, we used for the first time in comparative perspective, surveys conducted in the 60s and in the 80s by different projects and research institutes in both countries. And this was really interesting because we were able, through the work in archives and in old newspapers and magazines, to find a couple of surveys that were really important for our argument, because as we're going to see later, one could argue that Argentines had always been more supportive to democracy than Brazilians. So this was one of the first things to put aside in order to strengthen our argument. We also analyzed the longitudinal series of opinion polls produced by Latino Barometro as far back as the 90s, when they started doing this, and data relating to the performance of the economy, which is really, really simple to gather. And the most important piece of the article is actually the historical reconstruction of the processes of implementation and development of policies of reparation and memory about authoritarian regimes, and about the roles played by the militaries in both countries. I have to give you an advice that it's not an objective of the paper to debate the role of the level of legitimacy of democracy in the possibility of survival or not of democratic regimes. I mean, I'm not going into this fight between different groups, right? In political science, we decided to take, in some way, a middle ground, saying that higher levels of adherence to democracy present an additional constraint for the adoption of authoritarian discourses and practices by political leaders in democratic contests. We say that, as I stated in the beginning of the presentation, saying that the political costs of doing this are higher, right, in countries that have higher levels of support to democracy. So to some extent, they would function as another element to protect democratic regimes from the authoritarian ambitions of relevant political actors, while we call in the paper some sort of democratic cushion, right? Which is higher in Argentina than in Brazil. So it's essential for our argument to demonstrate that there is no evidence that Argentina had a level of adherence to democracy that was clearly high from the one that we have in Brazil in the 60s. We found in this magazine, Atlântida, published in 1965, a little bit before the legislative elections in Argentina, we found a survey that was in which there was a question about whether the coups were justified in the country. So 62% of the respondents in Buenos Aires believed they were sometimes justifiable, while 6% believed they were always justifiable, and only 20% indicated that coups were never justifiable. In Brazil, thanks to our archive at Unicamp, we have all the pollings that Ibope produced since the 40s. We were able to find also a couple of very, very, very interesting surveys they conducted in Rio de Janeiro and São Paulo 2 months after the military coup in March 1964. So in São Paulo, 56%, and in Rio, 57% of those interviewed said they were in favor of revoking electoral mandates, something that had actually happened a couple of weeks before with the coup, and suspending political rights. In São Paulo, 54% of respondents said that the position of João Goulart, the then president, had been beneficial for the country, while 20% said it had been harmful, right? And in Rio, in June of the same year, in June 64, 62% said they would accept that Marshal Castelo Branco, the first president, the first military president, would remain in power after 65, even without elections, if he led a good administration. If he was a good president, people said that it was okay for him to remain in power, while 28% said they would not accept his leadership. So with that, we were able to say, look, it's not the same question. We know there are many problems in comparing them, but we cannot assume that it was clearly higher in Argentina, the support for democracy, than it was in Brazil. From the second half of the 80s, with the democratization process, opinion polls were carried out with greater comparability, especially using the same questions. In 1988, a project developed by researchers in Uruguay, Brazil, Argentina, and Chile found that 40% support democracy in the city of São Paulo and 76% in the city of Buenos Aires. So by 88, we were able to see that there was a huge difference between the support for democracy in two countries. In 95, Latino Barometer begins its series with percentages very similar to those observed in 88, right? So 76% of respondents in Argentina said that democracy is preferable to any other form of government, while only 41% responded in the same way in Brazil. So data available for the period that follow the transitions from authoritarian regimes, they demonstrate that Argentines start the new regime with a substantially higher level of support for democracy than Brazilians. So here are the first figure, in which I have the Latino Barometer series. In red, it shows the support in Argentina, and in blue in Brazil. We have some variations in that, especially between 2002 and 2010. We explained that in the paper. I'm not going over this right now, but maybe we can talk about this later. And it's very interesting that never the level of support in democracy in Argentina was lower than the highest point in Brazil. So this is very consistent. To strengthen our argument, besides saying that Argentines were not more supportive to democracy than Brazilians in the 60s, we also had to dismiss some like classical variables when we talk about support for democracy, right? So the first one was economy. And as we can see here, in Argentina, there are huge much more dramatic drops than actually in Brazil. And if all the literature would be perfectly correct about the two cases, it would say that we would have seen or experienced more variation in support for democracy in Argentina than we actually had, and we had much more in Brazil. So this is the data about the GDP, and it's incredible how Argentina is like ups and downs and throughout all these years. And another variable we had to take out was the variable regarding socialization during democratic regimes or during authoritarian regimes. So there is, it's not huge, but it's considerable literature, especially analyzing the case of Spain after the death of Franco and the transition to democracy in that country, that said that there was a difference between old people and young people, and according to the pass of the time, they would converge. So this was something we also had to check. And what can we see from these two graphs? In the left one, in the left side of the presentation is the Brazil case, and in the hand side is the Argentine case. And we can see that there's no big variation among age groups, right? In both countries. In Argentina has always been bigger between all groups. And another very common and very often used variable is related to the schooling range, right? And it says that, well, the more educated is the person, more supportive to democracy he or she is, which is actually true for both countries, right? But it's different in the level of support for democracy. So when we take like someone with elementary incomplete in Argentina, he in the mean, right? This is the mean for the whole period. In the mean, 57% would say that they support democracy. In Brazil, only 37%, and this goes up until 82% in Argentina with higher education complete, and 69% in Brazil. So the first part of the paper is basically that. I mean, we are trying to say, well, the most used variables, they don't explain this weird difference between Brazil and Argentina. Also, time doesn't explain, because in the 60s, we don't have an evidence that Argentines were more supportive for democracy than Brazilians. And to end this part of the presentation regarding the data, it's very interesting to highlight the findings of this a series of research carried out in Argentina, urban centers between 82 and 88 by different research institutes and government agencies. This survey shows a rapid increase between 1982 and 1984, right? Exactly the period of the Malvinas War, the building of the how do you say that? The draft of the CONADEP, which was like a relatório. How do I say that? I missed the word.
The
report, right? Yeah, it was
report?
True Commission report, and the beginning of the discussion about the trial of the junta. So it's really interesting, and we can discuss that later if you want. So for our argument, let me just do this. For our argument, a fundamental difference lies in the ways in which these authoritarian governments should have handled overpowering the transition and their margin of negotiation of certain prerogatives for the armed forces, especially the guarantee of impunity for the crimes committed. It's in the way collective memory of the crimes committed under dictatorship was processed in the beginnings of democratic governments that we find a key element to understand the contrasts in the subsequent social support for democracy in Argentina and Brazil. And of course, this is related to the development of the policies regarding memory and justice in both countries. So in Argentina, as I was saying, the trial of the juntas in 1985 and the official publication of the report of the National Commission on the Disappearance of Persons, the CONADEP, was really important, because it was brought by the state to the public testimonies of survivors of the atrocities committed by the regime. And this was hugely public, in the sense that most media talked about it and discussed it. So it was really important to clarify the facts and the rationale that had characterized the repression. I'm not going over it. We talked a little bit about that in Brazil. In Argentina, it was more a dynamic of killing and disappearance. In Brazil, it was more a dynamic of torture. So there were some differences. And I don't have the time to talk about this here, but we take for granted that this kind of difference were not able to explain the difference in the support of democracy, right? Because the atrocities in the Brazilian case were also amazing, right? As we learned much later at the Truth Commission, and also private reports issued by the Archdiocese of São Paulo and other groups. So in Argentina, we had that official, like transitional justice or transitional judgment, and in Brazil, these testimonial voices would only be officially authorized decades later, and with significant legal limitations. So we talk about this in the paper. Limitations were like some of the torturers, they were obliged to appear to be interrogated, but they could remain in silence and nothing would happen to them. So this was a real legal limitation that happened to the Brazilian Comissão da Verdade, launched by President Dilma in 2011. So coming back or going back to the transition period, the outgoing authoritarian government in Brazil had a greater margin to obtain prerogatives such as the autonomy of the armed forces, preservation of the constitutional right to intervene in the internal order, famous Article 142 that all the groups that support Bolsonaro always claim in demonstrations. Please use the 142. We want the armed forces to shut down the Congress and to shut down the Supreme Court. And above all, a guarantee that investigations into human rights violation would not be open, or they will not be punished. What happened, we are going to see later, with the amnesty law of 1979. In Argentina, on the other hand, the military junta had to hand over power in conditions of weakness, seeing the guarantee frustrated. In a very famous paper in which Stepan compares the power of the militaries during the transition, he's very clear in saying that the civilian control in Brazil was much weaker than in Argentina. The validity of the amnesty law in the governments after 85 in Brazil established a restricted democratic socialization, which impeded the possibility of collective learning about the trauma generated by the authoritarian experience. Under the legal framework of this law, the amnesty law of 1979, the transitional governments did not implement memory policies until 2011, and a very shy one. Throughout the 90s, a paradigm of state passivity was composed in the production of the truth about the crimes of the dictatorship with different measures. In all of them, the burden of proof had to be collected and provided by actors in society. So this was really different from Brazil and Argentina, right? Under the Cardoso administration, he opened a special commission to evaluate cases in which people suffered during the dictatorship, but the burden to collect the proofs were by the victims. So it was not something actually done by the state, right? So the state only assumed the responsibility for producing real information on human rights violation with the creation of Comissão Nacional da Verdade in 2011, as I mentioned before. So this was different from what happened in Argentina. The military and transitional justice policy carried out by the Alfonsine was much stronger than in Brazil, although it had some setbacks, as we state in the paper. The trial in 1985 of the members of the military junta was a historic milestone that brought international attention in a context of deep tension with the armed forces, who, of course, didn't want to be judged by a civilian court. The importance of this judgment for Argentine society and transitional period was considerable, not only in terms of the impact on public opinion of images of commanders being judged, but also for having given public voice to numerous testimonies of survivors who participated as witnesses. And well, beyond the measures taken by the first democratic government and its limits, an element ought to highlight for our argument in the paper is that the armed forces' efforts to assure their impunity and their sectoral demands of Alfonsine ended up displacing them in the eyes of Argentine society from their historical role as an arbitration power to a merely corporate one. This is exactly, or it's not, I'm not going to say the opposite, but this is very different in Brazil. Military sees themselves, they see themselves like this. And a huge part of society also see themselves as some sort of a group possessing this arbitration power. As I was saying here, nothing similar is happening in Brazil, where the veto power of the military to transitional justice was effective, and where the president of the transition, José Sarney, stated that the armed forces as an institution should not be questioned for their actions. There are a couple of passages in the paper in which we quote former Army General Eduardo Vilas Boas, and he says in a testimony to Celso Castro from Fundação Getúlio Vargas, he clearly says, well, we study a lot of what happened in Argentina and Chile, and we were decided not to allow this to happen in Brazil. So we actually acted against the Truth Commission created by Dilma in 2011. So I can go now to the final remarks and the contributions of the paper. The first one is that public policies of the first democratic governments regarding the crimes of the dictatorship, as well as the way in which the transition itself conditioned the policies implemented in subsequent decades, outlined the similar scenarios regarding the memory of the authoritarian experience in Argentina and in Brazil. And then we end the paper with two questions. Would support for democracy in Brazil be the same if state crimes carried out during the authoritarian regime had been duly judged? Could the government in Argentina defend the latest authoritarian experiment without freeing the electoral costs of that action? Our answer to both questions is no. So to sum up the contributions, we have two main contributions, as I outlined in the beginning of this presentation. The first concerns factors that can influence the levels of adherence to democracy in countries with recent authoritarian experience. We emphasize the existence of a variable that cannot be ignored, the construction of memory and justice for crimes carried out under authoritarianism. And the second deals with the long-term aspects, something very, very important for historic institutionalism, of the different types of transition experience. The different institutional configurations resulting from the transitional process in both countries produce different political trajectories that helped both to shape the perception of authoritarian regimes and guarantee different capacities for political intervention of the armed forces. In the sense, we put that in the end of the paper. Our work helps to explain the recent military influence on Brazilian politics, with many ministries, with many important positions under the Bolsonaro administration. So I would finish with that. Sorry for I really don't like doing these presentations online. It gets worse with the language and because I'm not seeing people, and it's a little bit, after 2 years, it's a little bit weird for me. It's still weird for me, but I'd like to thank you, Anthony, and looking forward to hear your comments and questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Oswaldo. It was clear, at least to me, and we have people online who probably wouldn't have been able to go to the thing at King's, so it kind of balances out. But I appreciate your presentation, and I wanted to start off maybe a round of questions for you to take. But if I could just abuse my proximity to you in this Zoom call, and just start it off. I have one question about, or I had two questions. One was about the relationship between survey opinion and political behavior. And you know a lot about this better than I do, but just to kind of complete the causal mechanism, you're finding that responses to survey questions in Argentina show a much more robust commitment to democratic values than they do in Brazil, and it doesn't pre-exist the authoritarian regime. And I find that all convincing. I guess, what's the evidence that responses to surveys, that we can infer from responses to surveys, that people will actually behave in ways that uphold those values? And I'm thinking of things like, challenges on the streets to democracy. So what's the state of the debate about this as well? So how easily we can infer behavior from survey research. And the other question I have is about, you made an interesting comment that you're putting your chips on the fact that the transitional justice mechanisms were different, and that's what explains the different levels of support for democracy. You talk about different authoritarian regimes, the different nature of the regimes. In other words, the stage of history before the transitional justice policies, before the transitions. And you say, well, that can't really explain it because they both committed human rights abuses. The atrocities were bad in both regimes. And so there's not enough variation there. And I guess if you dig a little deeper, you might be able to make an argument that, for one thing, the Brazilian regime was a lot longer lasting. Its economic policies arguably transformed the country much more fundamentally than did the Argentine regime, which had a failed, neoliberal reconstruction, which ended in a recession. The nature of the pattern of violence was very different in both regimes. So is there a way to test, maybe, for that alternative hypothesis that it was the nature of the regimes as well as the nature of the transition to democracy that could explain the difference in commitment to democracy in survey research? And I guess I also wanted to add that on the issue of the impact of the transitional justice measures, there are some dissenting voices. I think your position is probably the consensual position, that the big trial was educative. It kind of gave lessons to civil society, and people learned of the atrocities and they became more committed to democracy. But there is a guy called Malamud Gotti who has a really interesting book called Game Without End, and he was an advisor to President Alfonsín. And his conclusion is that the transitional justice measures were kind of ambivalent in terms of their impact on public opinion, because many of the convictions were overturned by Carlos Menem. They looked very political. They were overturned, and then they were overturned again by the Kirchners. And so transitional justice looked like it was a policy of particular governments more than it was the Argentine state. And for some people, this generated cynicism and kind of, apathy rather than strong, robust commitment to democracy. So, and I'm not saying that Malamud Gotti represents the consensus view in Argentina, but he does have this book where he argues this. So would you prefer that I get some more questions for you so that you can take several in the round, Oswaldo, or?
Can I just answer those three, because they're really hard?
Okay, and then I'll open it up. I promise everyone will have a chance to ask questions.
Oh, I'm going to be quick because I don't know the answers, but I'll do my best. Well, survey opinion and political behavior. Well, the only way to check this properly would be to have like some sort of experiment in one of the surveys. We didn't have, especially because we were dealing with surveys like done a long time ago. But it seemed to us that these demonstrations in Brazil, they are very inconsistent with the things that we found. I mean, we have like around 40 or 50% people supporting democracy. So the other half doesn't care, or they think that sometimes it's better an authoritarian regime, right? Especially when they ask those questions about like, would you support a military coup in case of corruption? I think corruption was like more than 50%. And there was another one, violence also. So they're very strong. What we're trying to say is that it affects in the sense that in Argentina it's harder for the politician to take this path, right? thinking that he is going to face elections, he has to face public opinion, he has to face voters. So what we are saying is that, well, it's maybe not, but it's not enough to save democracy, but it is another element of constraint for kinds of authoritarian behaviors, not only like testimonies or discourses, but behaviors actually acting like specific figures in the Brazilian government last year. So that's what we say, and that's why we say the paper is important in one sense, right? It's not about only explaining this variation, which is, for me as a political scientist, very interesting, but it has a bigger argument that says, well, when you have that, you have one more constraint. And of course, we don't do that in the paper, but it's a way perhaps to articulate these both literatures, the one more cultural, right? And the one more connected to rational choice. So we can say, well, a cultural element can be taken into account in the costs of actions by politicians, right? So that's what we are trying to say in the paper, although not directly. Different nature of the regimes, it's possible. It's possible. As we try to say, we are not saying that this is the only variable. It's possible. We don't have how to check it. However, we take for granted that if the Brazilian authoritarian regime and its crimes had been exposed as in Argentina, the support for democracy would be big. So our variable still holds. I mean, even if we're talking about much more assassinations and disappearances in Argentina, the cases of the babies and all the atrocities that happened there, it was much more, I'm not going to say institutionalized, because in Brazil also was institutionalized, but in Argentina was more hierarchical, right, than in Brazil. So they were different, but we take that if it had been exposed, would be a little bit different. The transitional justice as was ambivalent. Yes, that's true. However, since the beginning of the democratic regime in Argentina, I'm not a specialist in Argentina, I have to tell you that. The specialist, it's my co-author, Dolores. But as far as I learned from her, there were some, but they had to reveal, right, to go back, right? Especially that there was one law that Alfonsín tried to pass, as far as I remember, saying, well, you have only 2 months to put all the cases to the justice, and then he had to go back with that decision. And there is another thing another element we say in the paper, another thing that happened is that there was an op-ed at La Nación saying, that's enough, right? When Macri won, that's enough, not talk about transitional justice anymore, not talk about what happened during the authoritarian regime anymore. And the rejection of the public opinion was massive. Journalists, people went to the streets to demonstrate. So it seems to me that since the Alfonsín government, it's stronger and more alive in Argentina, of course, than it is in Brazil. And the other piece of evidence, which it's very important, although we cannot stress a lot on it because they don't have the specific questions we use, is that series of surveys, some taken by the own Argentine government between 82 and 84. Right, it shows an increase from like 70% to 90% in 2 years of the support of elections and things like this. These surveys, they said to us, well, something happened here, right? Something started to happen here, and it was like returning, right, during time over the policies of reparation and memory. So that's how I would answer. Thank you, Anthony.
Thanks, Oswaldo. So now I think we're going to open the floor. If anyone listening would like to unmute themselves, we can take a round of 3 questions for Oswaldo, and then give him back a chance. So I see that Christy has raised her hand. Christy, do you want to unmute yourself, and then Sheena?
Hi. Hi. I have 2 questions in the relationship of the comparison of democracy in terms of Argentina, because I wanted to know in what sort of variable did you put both Peronismo and Kirchnerismo in the comparison of democracy? Because there's a lot of literature, and I know the Argentinian literature is pretty divided in how you consider Kirchnerism. They enacted all of these laws of like memory, but they pretty much enacted, they had a lot of authoritarian behavior. They were not an authoritarian regime, but they did have a lot of populist and authoritarian behavior, their fight with the press, their idea of trying to intervene the judicial system, while at the same time doing transitional, justice. So the people who supported that was actually the same people who were supporting the Kirchnerism in the threat to democracy. And I think like O'Donnell makes it very simple. Kirchnerism is also a threat to democracy. So how do you compare it in the way you analyze the tolerance of Argentinians of authoritarian behavior after the regime? Because the Kirchnerism were the biggest enactors of policy, memory policy.
Oswaldo, Christy, can we go to Shima now? Take 2, maybe 2 this round.
Yeah, okay. Thanks for your presentation and very interesting topic. I have like a follow-up question on what Anthony just mentioned. It's regarding the causal pathway. So it's basically like how the level of public support for democracy, like inferred or measured by the public opinion survey, would affect this elite discourse celebrating or not celebrating this authoritarian legacy, in Brazil celebrating, and in Argentina actually because of the strong civil society actually and the strong memory of the Plaza de Mayo events prevented political elites from celebrating, these kind of events, or it has something to do with the mode of transition, its collapse versus negotiated mode of transition in 2 countries, mediated by the role of the civil society that actually allowed for this discourse to thrive or to get some sort of societal penetration. So related to this point, you mentioned that how under the rule of the Labour Party, especially Dilma Rousseff in Brazil, how the political regime managed, to open, the topic of all the crimes committed by the military junta in Brazil. Does it have something to do with the level of support, as you referred to, with the high level of mass support for democracy under the Labour Party? Or again, it's related to historical setting and institutional configuration and the relationship between the military or the civil military relation in both countries? Okay. So it's basically regarding the causal pathway.
Okay, Shima, can I ask, I had some connection problems here. Can you repeat the second question?
Yeah, so the second question is related to my first one. So you highlighted in the paper how Dilma managed, to push through this kind of military trials, or to open again, these crimes committed by, to retrieve the popular memories regarding to the crimes committed by the military junta in Brazil. But actually, she failed, or the political regime failed, to push through these kind of trials. So did it, or does it have something to do with the high level of support? Because you mentioned that in Brazil in 2003, I think through 2009 or 10, it was like high level of support, like mass support for democracy. So it has something to this, what actually offered incentives or did encourage Delma to open the case, or it has something to do, again, because you mentioned that she failed. So you reverted it back to the institutional setting or the civil-military relations that actually they date back to the mood of transition, how like the military actually orchestrated, like planned the whole democratic transition in Brazil in comparison to the collapsed transition in Argentina. You got it?
Yeah, I got it. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot.
Oswaldo, you want to take those?
Yeah,
those
sure.
two, and then
Well,
we'll go back and have another round.
Thank you, Christy and Shima. Well, I'm not going really into this. There's a huge discussion between Argentine political scientists. What was actually Kirchnerism? I'm saying you're. I understand you were taking the idea of the delegative democracy that O'Donnell developed in the last years he was working. And he pointed some countries and some regimes as descending as authoritarian ones. And well, what we can say is that two things I think I can answer to you, Christy. First is that we have witnessed this descending level of support of democracy in Argentina. This is something we address in the end of the paper, right? Especially among young people, right? It is in its worst level. In the elections, in the last elections, we actually had one candidate like saying good things about the authoritarian regime and economic path that he took, things like that. Although he was not highly voted, but it was already there. So what we state in the paper is that it has worked as a cushion, right? More in Argentina than in Brazil. I mean, what we say is that never a candidate for the presidency in Argentina would have said what Jair Bolsonaro said and be the president, right? He would be ousted by the political system before, right? Those democracy guardrails, right? Political parties would have not chosen him because the political costs of backing someone like this are really high, right? And can spill all over the party and legislative elections, for instance. In the case of Brazil, this is different. I mean, Bolsonaro, we say that in the paper. Bolsonaro, when he voted for the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff, he said, "I vote." They lost in '64. They lost again. My vote is in the memory of Coronel Brilhante Ustra, o pavor de Dilma Rousseff, right? That's exactly how he voted, and 2 years later he was elected president, right? So that's what we say. I mean, there are different political costs, right? And now connecting a little bit about your question and about Shima, what we try to say in the paper is that everything started with the transition and the conditions of the transition, right? However, there is we don't say that formally in the paper, but that's the idea, right? However, we have an intervening variable that is the capacity of intervention from the armed forces, right? So they both start at the same time, but the capacity of the armed forces to intervene in political matters, it starts to work as an independent variable, to use more like traditional language for political scientists, right? So they were always blocking measures, and they always had the power to block those measures. When Dilma was ousted, the first thing Temer did was to put lots of militaries in the government, right? He was backed by the militaries. The militaries were really tired of Dilma and what happened. And the Truth Commission started in 2011, although with tons of legal limitations. And this was a struggle between the Workers' Party. We also mentioned that in the paper. There was a group saying, let's try to review the 1979 law and bring those people for trial, right? And there was another part that said, no, let's leave the way it is. It's better this way. And in the end, the Supreme Court actually said, no, the amnesty law is still valid and it should be respected. And anyway, we are now paying this price as an outcome for our public policy. We didn't do the job correctly. That's the hard to say, of course, easy to say, hard to do, easy to say for me 30 years, 40 years later, right? But we didn't do the job correctly. We thought we were doing like a great transition, paradigmatic transition, as a book by Cardozo, saying like, wow, we are much better than even Spaniards. Look what we are doing. And there's no free lunch. We have Bolsonaro as a president, right? So there is a quote by Schmidt and O'Donnell that we put in the final remarks, in which they say in the conclusions from the book, The Transition from Authoritarian Rules, and they say, well, it's very difficult to imagine how a country would go over this history without making its amendment with the past. I mean, I'll read the quote, because it's exactly what we try to say as a policy outcome in the paper, right? It's difficult to imagine how a society can return to some degree of functioning which would provide social and ideological support for political democracy without somehow coming to terms with the most painful elements of its own past. By refusing to confront and to purge itself of its worst fears and resentments, such a society would be burying not just its past, but the very ethical values it needs to make its future livable. This one's from 1986, right? Transitions from authoritarian rule. So, so that's
Oswaldo?
Yeah.
Can I ask you a question about that?
Yeah. Well, can I just? I would go
a
little bit over with Shima.
Go ahead.
Okay. Well, Shima, I think Dilma managed to open, although it was very restricted. And it's hard to say if it was a smart move or not, right? Probably if she had kept support in the Congress and everything else, it would be seen like as a smart move, because now at least we have some official report, something that we never had. But since she failed and the pressure from the militaries were strong, right? We cannot forget the messages from General Vilas Boas by the time, and when Lula was also being, when the Supreme Court was taking the decision if Lula would be able to run for presidency or not back in 2018, General Vilas Boas tweeted, well, we are watching you guys, right? So I think that's different from Argentina, and that's of course started in the transition period and the conditions of it. That's what we think, and what we tried to show in the paper.
Oswaldo, if I could follow up, I thought one of the most interesting things about the paper was your argument about demands for transitional justice or accountability that come from civil society, because you say that they don't have the same impact as those that come from the state. And I think you're probably right about that, but I wanted to know your reasoning a bit more, because you do point out that in 1985, right at the beginning, when you first have a indirectly elected civilian president, you have this very important book, Brazil Nunca Mais, put together by the church, mostly Catholic church, but also some Protestant churches. Very interesting research in military justice, showing how often torture was used, showing how systematic torture was used under the dictatorship. And it's a bestseller. You know, it goes through 26 or 27 or 28 different editions. It's still in print today. It has an impact on public opinion. But what you're saying is, and you might think if the ultimate variation you're looking at is public support for democracy, you know, you might think on the face of it, it shouldn't matter whether demands for accountability come from civil society or from the state, as long as you're, you know, having an impact on what people think, on public opinion, on debate. Maybe it should be the same. But I think your argument is very important, because you're saying, no, in Argentina, there was a trial, right, with public prosecutors, a trial of people from the junta. There was an official appointed commission from the president saying this is what happened. And I think you're right that has an impact that's very, very different from what we saw with Brazil and Unicamp. And I just wanted what your reasoning is, why there's such a big difference between a civil society initiative and a state initiative, if in the end, what we're interested in is civil society support for democracy rather than some state commitment.
Okay, thank you for the question. And nobody asked about Uruguay so far, and Uruguay also helps us, I think, to answer your question, because in Uruguay, unfortunately, we didn't have like the space to include Uruguay, especially in our final remarks, which would be interesting, because what happened in Uruguay was that they started this process of transitional justice, and then they stopped and did a plebiscite. And people said, we don't want to judge. We don't want to take these people into trial. This had been reversed in the last years, right? But there was a plebiscite. And the process of the plebiscite make everything that happened public. So when people ask us, well, Uruguay has strong support for democracy and never had a specific trial, right? And we say, well, it didn't have, but it had all the process of discussion of that during the time, right? And of course, it's really difficult to compare Uruguay to Brazil and Argentina because of the size, population, how information circulate and everything. But so I think Uruguay also helps to answer your question. I mean, the repercussion in the public opinion by something done by the state, it's totally different from the church. We talk about something very, very common in Brazil when you talk to people that support the military regime, is what we call in the paper the theory of two demons, right? You had like the militaries, but you also had those people burning banks, robbing banks, kidnapping ambassadors, killing other people in those actions. So, and this is very strong in Brazil, right? It's very strong. And I think that when you have like reports like Brasil No Camais, who is an amazing report, an amazing work by many people, right? Led by Dom Paulo Evaristo Arnes by the time, who had a very important role in the end of the authoritarian regime. I mean, without having the state saying, well, this is actually what happened, we are going to put these people into trial. If they are convicted, they are going to be in jail or be in their homes or whatever. But this is the official recognition. This made possible, I mean, I think, the endurance of this idea of two demons, which was different in Argentina. They tried to do that in the end of the military regime, when they were discussing how it would be if it would have or not a trial, and it was dismissed by the report by CONADEP. Right? So I think that was the difference. I mean, by that time, media was like, let's not discuss that much, especially television, and which was by that time the biggest information source and media source in Brazil. So I think it was different. It would be impossible for Rede Globo not to show a general being in trial, right? It would be impossible. They would have to. something that actually they never did, only in soap operas in mid-90s, right?
Christoph, do you want to come in?
Yes, thank you very much, Oswaldo, for this comparison. This is really fascinating. I'm not at all a specialist, but listening to you, I thought I would ask a somewhat different question out of curiosity only. When we look at Bolsonaro's discourse and attitude and policies, the fact that there are so many people from the army in so many positions in the Brazilian state today, I just wonder what part of the legacy you are describing, what part of the legacy of the authoritarian past is it building upon? What is the affiliation? What is the connection? And what is still unacceptable, if anything? I don't know if it makes sense, but I'm wondering.
That's a great question. Thank you, Christoph. We argue in the paper that because we didn't have this kind of state-sponsored transitional justice, it was able for many people to reinvent some sort of idyllic past from the authoritarian regime, especially thinking the idea of order. So the idea of order is really important for Bolsonaro supporters, right? And because they are conservatives, right? So they say, well, in the authoritarian regime, it was good. We didn't have that crime, which is not true. We don't have data. We didn't have corruption, which is probably not true at all, because we know that under authoritarian regimes, corruption seems to be higher. It doesn't matter if it's a right wing or left wing, right? But they were able to rebuild this history. So this was possible because of that, right? So but regarding exactly to your question, I think they take the idea of order, right? And a more hierarchical society when, like, as quoting our Ministry of Family and Human Rights, men used to wear blue and women used to wear pink, right? Things like this. So, but it's an imagined past. It's not actually true. I mean, poverty was astonishing. Inequality was amazing. We had like a huge immigration for the cities without any planning, right? So, but this is, I think this is what they highlight.
And you suggest that this imagination or this imagined past has been made possible because precisely there was no work on history, not attempt at writing the history of what really happened. Because why is it that easy to work on such an imagination?
Okay. I would not overplay my hand with that, but what we say in the paper is that we didn't have enough discussion. We didn't have enough transparency. We didn't have, and we didn't show enough to the public opinion, people in general. People, they are not like interested in politics, but they watch the news at 8 o'clock. I mean, we didn't do enough to at least to make possible for the people to say, well, democracy isn't perfect, but it's better than when people were tortured, right? We didn't do that. That's our main, I think that's one of the main points in the paper.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Shima, would you like to come in?
Yeah. I just have like a minor comment on what Christoph just mentioned. And Oswaldo, perhaps, you can correct me if I'm wrong. So this kind of collective memory, it has something to do in Brazil with how they defined what happened, whether or not it was a coup d'etat, because they didn't see it as like an authoritarianism in the first place. So it was like, the public, or it was like people took to the streets in order to call upon the army to intervene and to put an end to the populist leadership and these kind of redistributive measures. So perhaps like how people label things or how people like perceive things is very important, and how they assign meaning to what happened. Because for them, they defined, the authoritarian regime or the military regime is not authoritarian, it was like a democratic, regime as well. So it was like it gained kind of public support and social support as well.
Yes, I agree. And then and recently someone released like letters between Huntington and Golbery and other people. And this was one of the things. I mean, yeah, make it appear like a democracy, like keep the Congress working, and you can have local elections and things like this. So I agree with your argument, and that's even more important. And I think it highlights the importance of not having discussed the crimes, because this would be something that, well, this happens in an authoritarian regime, and it doesn't, or should not, at least should not. We know the violence in Brazil is amazing. Violence, again, we have moral judgment. The police simply kills because they think the guy is guilty, right? But at least this should not happen in a democracy. Right? But I think you are correct. You are correct. For many people, things were like looking like some sort of democracy.
Well, I think we have time for one round of questions. If there's interest on the part of the people on the call, feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question of Oswaldo. Or, put up your hand if you want to do that.
Feel free to write me, any of you, if you want the paper, if you haven't had the opportunity to receive it, I'll be more than happy to send the piece. We are still
Oswaldo?
working on its final
Could I just
arrangements to send for publication.
Could I just ask how you got into this topic? Because a lot of your work is quite contemporary. It's about, I noticed that your master's and your PhD was pretty much about what was happening at the time in the Workers' Party. And a lot of your published work is on contemporary public opinion, contemporary political behavior. How did you get into this topic?
Well, thank you for the question, Anthony. In the Institute of Democracy, which is supported by the Ministry of Science and Technology, one of the parts was a comparison between Argentina and Brazil. So we did surveys in both countries. I don't use. It's funny because I don't use that surveys, but they gave me the hint, and then I started to talk with my co-author, who also knows a lot about Argentine politics and transition and what happened in Argentina after democratization. And she agreed with the main idea of the argument. Of course, when we started to check the data and everything, we saw that it was not that strong as we first imagined, but even though that was something in there that we should talk about. And so that's why I got interested. The idea perhaps is to work on something else using those surveys, because in those surveys we ask like about confidence in institutions. Armed forces, for instance, is something that is really different in both countries, and other things. So that's probably perhaps the next step, because comparing is really interesting, because you have the opportunity to.
And do you have some ideas on what causes that fluctuation in Argentina? Because to me, it looked very much correlated with the economic crisis.
Yes, in both countries, it is. I actually ran a Pearson test, and it's correlated. In both countries, both in Brazil and in Argentina.
There's the sovereign debt default, huge crash. There's the 2009-10 crisis.
Yeah, exactly.
Crash.
But
Yeah.
it's not in Argentina. It's not as wide as in Brazil, right? And it has a limit. That's the thing. But it's correlated. The support for democracy and the economy. It's correlated, but doesn't explain the variation between countries.
And does this hypothesis work with Chile?
Sorry?
Does the conclusion, because the next step could also to enlarge the comparison, and would the trajectory of Chile somewhat substantiate your main conclusion?
I think so. We thought about Chile as well. It's interesting because the support for democracy is in the middle between Argentina and Brazil. And also had a negotiated transition.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it wasn't as negotiated, or militaries didn't, in the end, had the power that Brazilian military still has, right?
Yeah.
So it's kind of in the middle. But I think it holds, but I don't know.
That is a great project, you know, to compare and test the hypothesis in as many countries as you can. That would be a terrific project. Yeah.
Someone asked for the paper. I can put it here. Do we have time?
Thanks. Yeah, thanks, Oswaldo. That would be good because I don't have Claudia's email. So if you can put it there, anyone can access it.
Yeah, hold on a second. Just have to find it here. This is a mess. Okay. Okay.
Thank you, Osvaldo.
Thank you. Anthony's out.
Yeah, no, I'm here. I would just say, let's continue this collaboration. Enjoy the rest of your visit to London. Enjoy the football tonight.
Yeah.
And I hope to see you quite soon. I hope to see you in Sao Paulo at some point in May.
Yeah,
but
great.
Yeah, let's continue this, and good luck with the manuscript. I'm sure it's going to be published quite soon.
Well, thank you very much to you all for watching this presentation and for the comments. And I hope we can keep working together with our projects and our new project. So thank you very much. And thank you, Anthony, again for the invitation, and King's Brazil Institute.
Thank you. See you next week.
See you. I will write you, Christoph. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye, Anthony.